So as I was saying, Elvis Presley once entered a Elvis lookalike competition and he came fourth. Obviously he entered anonymously.
I have never heard that fact before, Alan.
No.
How fascinating.
I know, thank you. And that's just a slice of the fascinating stuff that we'll discuss today, completely unrelated to Elvis Presley. On the Religion and Popular Culture podcast. But I think you should do the introduction today, Vivian. I did all last time.
I do think impersonations would be a really interesting topic. I don't know how exactly I would tie it into everything, but give me some time.
We'll find a way.
I will find a way.
Because what does it even mean to impersonate?
I did, we'll get into the topic in a second. And I went to MCM, and there was someone who was cosplayed as Slenderman, which obviously I did my PhD on. And there was a moment where I was just like, I should have cosplayed as Slenderman. I know him too well.
Yeah.
I have spent 4 years studying this thing. I should have just cosplayed that. And I was tempted to get my photo with it because I was like, well, because I know you so well.
Yeah, you've dedicated 4, 5, 6 years of your life to...
That's what I should have done. Should have done that. Oh well. What are you going to do?
Yes, but of course it's always nice to get a little bit of a break from your PhD topic once you're done with it.
Yeah.
Some distance is good. I saw there was an American academic cosplayed L. Ron Hubbard for a New Religious Movements lecture. Oh, I just saw it on Twitter very briefly. If by some miraculous coincidence you are the person I'm referring to, lovely listener, and you did dress as L. Ron Hubbard for your students for a lecture on New Religious Movements, please get in touch and let us know, because it was very amusing. I recall that he was dressed in naval gear like L. Ron Hubbard would when he was Commodore of the Sea Org, and he also was holding a copy of Dianetics. So in terms of cosplaying one subject, I've been beaten to the punch. But if you are that person, get in touch. I thought it was very amusing, but I think there's no way I could find out who you are.
Maybe if we ever do an in-person pod for whatever reason, if people would be interested in this.
Yes, if we're at a conference or something,
but if there is, then maybe we should both cosplay. I'll cosplay as Slenderman, and you'll be L. Ron Hubbard.
What a combo! Never been happened before. It'd be great, wouldn't it? But this is a nice way of tying in some of your research, because, lovely listeners, Vivian is currently undertaking a big research project on cosplay and its intersections with fandom and religion and so forth.
Yeah, and you can follow information about it on my website, incidentalmythology.com.
Yes.
I'm also going to be starting vlogs soon, actually. I figured I've been meaning to have a lot more interaction of following the research process, but so far it hasn't really. I haven't really been doing a hell of a lot. But I'm gonna have to start putting things into hyper gear. So I thought it would inspire me to do work as well as help people see the boring steps of actually what it takes to do a big research project.
I think of an academic vlog on cosplay involving clips of you at a con, for example, chatting to people and seeing what goes down would be really interesting to see. I would watch it.
Oh, well, thank you.
So
I get one view.
You'll get one view, and I'm sure our lovely listeners as well would be interested.
Yeah, I'll plug it once I'm doing it.
Yeah, absolutely. So it's in the works. It's
works.
Bubbling away in the cauldron, and eventually your methodological cauldron is bubbling away.
But speaking of other things I'm doing, and this gets us on topic.
This does. Excellent.
I have been spending a lot of time listening to one in particular actual play podcast. So what this means for people who are not as nerdy as me, I am listening to a podcast which is a recording of people playing a tabletop role-playing game. There's a lot of these that are D&D based. I think Critical Role is one of the biggest ones. I have not really spent a lot of time with Critical Role. I have watched I've listened to D&D is for Nerds, for example, and things like that. But this one is a different system. It's not D&D. It's a made-up world that they have entirely created of their own volition. It is not as, like, fantasy thing, so there's not, like, gnomes and elves and stuff like that. It's very kind of steampunky almost. But part of it was that they also, in creating this world, they also created a religion.
Mm.
You can see where I am going with this. They are very creative. The story is really good. For people who are really interested, it's Campaign Skyjacks. The beginning of it is Star Wars, which I think I've actually talked about the Star Wars one on this before, when I was listening to the version of it when it was Star Wars. And then when one of the players, well, their DM actually left, they swapped to do Skyjacks, which is their own made-up world of Spear, with flying pirate ships and cool things like that. But in it, they created their own religion. And there are points in it where I think it's really cool. And then there are points in it where the anthropologist of religion in me goes, that's not how religion works.
Mm. Yes.
And I think we've talked about this briefly before, of how sometimes TV shows or movies or books or role-playing games will kind of craft a religion, and we will be reading it or watching it or enjoying it, and we will just sit there and go, you're not.
Yeah,
This isn't
yeah.
right.
It
So
really does suck you out of the world,
Yeah,
doesn't it?
and I'm sure we have some really lovely listeners who are interested in writing their own fictional worlds or are already doing so. Maybe they DM or play their own role-playing games, or they just enjoy it. And so I thought what might be an interesting episode, and hopefully I'm right, is to go through kind of some of the things that I think really stand out to us. Like the big things that get hit with me and I go, oh, you really don't understand how religion works. So if you want to create your own religion in your own fictional space, however you might interpret the phrasing of fictional space, as we've already complicated that a couple of times on this podcast, then these are things to think about to make a really realistic, like the way that people actually engage with religion. So that's what I think we're going to be talking about today. And I'm excited about it.
Yes, that sounds fun, and a lot of rich areas to dive into here.
There's a lot, and I think that, I probably could have picked up on just this podcast, gotten you to listen to a couple of episodes, and we could have just done a deep dive on that. But I think that maybe people who haven't listened to it, or if we picked something like Star Trek or something like that, they might feel a little bit of a disconnect. So this might be a bit more of general stuff. I will be referring to the podcast a couple of times, so I'm very sorry. I know that Alan hasn't listened to it. I know that's a very niche thing to be referencing, but it's just as an example point. But I'm sure as we go through, there'll be other examples from other pop culture that Alan will be able to pop in with that might be a bit more relevant to a lot of people than a really niche actual play podcast that I'm currently listening to.
Well, I'm already thinking immediately of a previous episode we did about the Star Trek Next Generation episode of Who Watches the Watchers.
Well, yes.
Where religion in that episode is very much framed in terms of belief. And belief in the Picard, because a quote primitive unquote, massive quotation marks around that word, culture is exposed to members of Starfleet, specifically Captain Picard, and almost a religion begins with the people who have seen the Picard and believe in the Picard. And we used it in that episode, which everybody should go and listen to if they haven't already, to discuss methodological issues in the study of religions. But immediately, religion there is framed as belief in something non-empirical, something... the episode even frames it as irrational. That
It does, yeah.
the episode essentially puts Starfleet and the Federation as an example of a society that has lost the need for belief in God. And Picard essentially says to one of the people from this planet that one day when you're able to fly to space, you won't need to believe in a deity. I'm paraphrasing, of course. It's a really good episode as an episode, but it's that thing that you were just alluding to, Vivian, that if you watch it from a scholar of religion point of view, it immediately pulls you out,
yeah.
and ruins the whole experience. I like the episode on its own, but when you unpick it from a critical religious studies perspective, it begins to fall apart very quickly. So I think something we find throughout this podcast, isn't it, is how we ruin pop culture for ourselves. We take something perfectly enjoyable and then we have to spoil it for it. We take a perfectly good episode of Star Trek, and there is an episode of Star Trek that I want to discuss in a future episode.
It's on the list, yes.
Yes, and I don't want to discuss it too much today, but it'll be a neat one to discuss later on because we can call back to the conversation we're going to have.
Very
today.
cool. I'm looking forward to it because I have not seen this episode yet.
Yes,
but we will.
Yes. Again, that's another good episode, which is very enjoyable if you can forgive the absolutely flagrant sexism. As with a lot of media from the 1960s.
Yes. Speaking of, okay, so there's people not in the UK. There is a very big UK show that was around, I don't know, 90s, early thousands, maybe. Time Team. What time period was original Time Team? Do you know?
Oh, Time Team.
It was big
wow.
UK.
You just opened
it's back now. It's crowdfunded and it's on YouTube. We're going to do an episode on Time Team, and I will tell you why. Are
we talking about the show that has Baldrick from Blackadder?
Yes.
He was the host
no longer
of it.
is the host of it.
If you're
they got a new host, and stuff, but they're crowdfunded now. They've got like a Patreon, and so some of their episodes are up on YouTube. And Tom grew up watching Time Team because he's English. It's a very English show. We did not get it in America, so I'm not expecting our American listeners to know what we are talking about, but you can probably find the old episodes on YouTube. It's basically this show where archaeologists go out and do a dig for like 3 days, and you get to follow what they're doing and how they dig and what they find and all that kind of stuff. And Tom is actually working at a place where a lot of Time Team people work.
Yeah, I imagine he would really dig Time Team. Oh, gosh, I'm so funny. I don't even realise that I'm doing it. But yeah, I can see that being your husband's
Yeah, it's
jam.
very much his jam. So we started watching some of the newer episodes, and there is an obsession with ritual in a way that drives me absolutely bonkers. So there was, I think we should do a whole episode on just like looking at something as an outsider and the perspectives of religion versus not religion that people as an outsider perspective, or the etic puts onto the emic, in other words, which we talked about those phrases in the other episode of Star Trek. But basically, like there was one point where they found a well and there were coins in the well, and so they were like, oh, this must be an act of ritual of throwing the coins in the well. And I was like, I don't really think that that's, it's kind of one of those things where it's like, if these same people watched me do that in, just in London or something, they probably wouldn't think of it as ritual, but because people did it in ancient Rome, it must be ritual. It was like, anyway. I think it would be interesting to talk about it. That's for a different day, but talk about our research ruining pop cultures. I was supposed to be enjoying this academic or archaeological thing with my archaeology husband, and the entire time I'm just like, why do they keep saying that about ritual?
A really good case for the need for interdisciplinary approaches to these ideas. Because that really does highlight how an interdisciplinary approach really does highlight different facets of a subject. Because, you do see that happening a lot. And I often find in pop culture that ritual is positioned the act of ritual is almost positioned on that social evolution, that Taylorian idea of social evolution that I feel like his name pops up a lot in this podcast.
Well, he impacted
Never
a lot.
in a good
he
light.
impacted a lot, unfortunately.
Yeah, and I find that not always, but a good amount of pop culture will discuss ritual in terms of something, again, primitive with enormous quotation marks around that word, and something that eventually people will grow out of and move past, because ritual tends to be doing an activity that could praise a non-existent deity, for example, or could be an activity that is perhaps violent and brutal and maybe even barbaric by contemporary standards. I often find that in Buffy the Vampire Slayer, which is a show I love. But often when the idea of ritual comes up in that show, it's often in a negative light. That Buffy and the Scoobies will discover that something's going down in Sunnydale, and oh no, it's tied into some sort of ritual that's in one of Giles's books. And surprise, surprise, it's a really bad thing, and people shouldn't be doing it. Yeah, exactly. Of course, if our friend Jonathan was here, they would say that that's no bad thing.
But yeah, so I think this is probably one of the first things that we often see is this idea of religion as being, something quote unquote primitive. And I think we mentioned this in that last season episode of Star Trek, but it bears repeating, which is that we keep saying quote unquote primitive because, as it might seem obvious to some of you, but might not be obvious to others, it's a very pejorative word, and it is tinged with a lot of things like racism, and classism, and all sorts of bad things like that. And it's often something that someone else will put on another group of people for very little reason. And
it was also reminding me when we were just having that discussion about the idea of ritual as being something primitive. It was reminding me of Edward Said's Orientalism. Which is something that if our lovely listeners haven't read Said's work on Orientalism, you absolutely should, because it's a very powerful critique of how particularly European, I was about to say Western, but I was going to say particularly European enlightened societies have positioned Orientalism, again I'm using quotation marks around the Orient, as a primitive and or barbaric society in comparison to a more progressed, monotheistic, perhaps even atheistic society.
And it's tinged with a lot of any of the things where you see Asian people in general as being very mystic is also very...
Yes. So there's a double edge to it, isn't there? On the one hand, it's barbaric and primitive, or on the other, it's mystic and taps into some sort of esoteric knowledge that we don't have in the West, or we may have lost in the West. But you'll often see it in pop culture with things like a hero will be stuck on their quest, but they will end up doing some training with the Oriental monk, and the monk will teach them about how to fight and how to... Even Yoda in Star Trek in Star Wars, I beg your pardon, committed the dreadful sci-fi sin. Even Yoda fits into that stereotype to a certain extent.
And you even see it in things like romantic comedies and Eat, Pray, Love, where, the white woman will run off to India or China or Japan and
discover
and connect
herself
better to herself and the world. And that's part of it, they're somehow special and different and mystic, and it's that kind of a thing when it's like you can find yourself anywhere.
You can find yourself anywhere, yeah, absolutely. But yeah, Edward Said's work on Orientalism really
Yes,
interesting
but
stuff.
so
Worth
basically
diving
the
into.
word primitive is a bit, just try not to use it in an actual
Yes.
sense. I did get into an argument with a student of mine because obviously first year essays we tend to get the word used a lot, even though I tell them not to. And so we had a conversation about it, and I had a student that said, well, it can't really be that bad because it's based in Latin.
Of course.
Well, so is the N word, but you're not going to be writing that in your paper anytime soon.
I do love the idea, and we do find, well, I've certainly encountered this in the humanities a lot, that if something is old, it is therefore legitimate and or correct.
Often it's the opposite.
And you often, and often you find that with understandings of religion as well, that if something is a classical understanding of religion, that it therefore stands up to scrutiny. Particularly certain theological understandings
Yes.
to religion which are steeped in heritage.
Which I think actually might bring us to an interesting second point that I find as an issue with it, which is when there is too much of a similarity, I think is the way of phrasing it, between the institutionalized religion and the lived religion. So what I mean by this is, I'll use the Catholic Church as an example.
I was going
to. It's a
to
good
as well.
example.
They are the best example for, yes, they are always the one I use.
So you have the kind of hierarchies. It's very structured. It's very, things are very written down of how things are supposed to go, what kind of things you're supposed to believe in, what kind of stuff happens at certain points in the church service. And that isn't always necessarily how the Catholic person who is just at home, living their everyday life, who is not a pope, is not a cardinal, is not even a priest, how they live their Catholicism. So I think one of the examples of this is so when you are doing Mass and they say the prayer over the little wafers. And in Catholic, based on the doctrine, based on the institution, that has magically turned that wafer into the actual body of Christ, which in a lot of the Protestant, it's a metaphor. It is not a metaphor based on the institution. And I stress this because your normal everyday Catholic is not A, going to care, and B, that's not how they're going to think of it. And there might be some who do, and there might be some who don't, but it doesn't mean that that person who doesn't isn't a Catholic.
Yes, there was a large survey that, if I remember, I'll send you the link and we can include it in the description, that demonstrated that the vast majority of practicing Catholics don't believe in the process of transubstantiation. But that has pedagogically affected the way that religion has been taught, particularly in schools. So I'm British, so I did religious education when I was in school, and I was taught in school that Catholics believe in transubstantiation. They believe that the body and the blood of Christ is literal in this sense, and there was no nuance to that discussion. Religious education has actually come a long way since then as well. I had fabulous RE teachers. I should stress,
they
I had
to follow
RE
a curriculum.
Without whom I wouldn't be sat here having this conversation with you right now. But yeah, they were following a curriculum that taught that this is just what Catholics believe, and that's that. And you do have that disconnect between the institution and the everyday practice. And I'm really glad that you mentioned Catholicism, and particularly the Vatican, because for some reason, when we were discussing the idea of creating a religion in a fictional world, the first thing that came to my mind were the sparrows from Game of Thrones.
Oh, right.
in the mid seasons of Game of Thrones, there's a extremist branch of one of the several religions that you find in Game of Thrones, Song of Ice and Fire, whichever medium you're discussing. And in the show, they're led by Jonathan Pryce, and good Welsh actor there. And when they essentially seize control of the capital, because they end up controlling a institution, a religious institution within the capital of Westeros that is quite clearly meant to be the Vatican. And when they seize control of of this quote unquote Vatican, they become incredibly I'm going to use the word inflict. They inflict extremist practices on members and on people living in the capital and the monarchy and so on. And there's a lot of really interesting... I know people have got really mixed feelings about Game of Thrones now with how the final few seasons ended, but there's a lot of really interesting stuff going on with those seasons. But I immediately, when we said about the idea of inventing a religion in a fictional space, I thought about the Sparrows as a critique of institutional religion, and specifically a critique of Catholicism. But what we see there is the critique of institutional Catholicism, and not your everyday Catholic who may not even have been to the Vatican. And simply may not even go to church once a week, but still considers Catholicism important to them. And that's another aspect as well, is the idea of a good Catholic or a good Muslim or a good Buddhist, because they do certain criteria, they meet certain criteria. Oh, well, they go to church once a week, ergo they are a good Christian, for example. And something that, it really grinds my gears. Because there's no such thing as a good Christian or a good Muslim. There are just Christians. There are just Muslims. And they do things in different ways that are interesting. It's not for us. And again, this is the kind of thing that I find in first-year essays. Not that I mean to rag on first-year essays. First years, you do a great job. Keep going. But it's something that we do have to break down with our students, because there is this idea of a good religious person because they do the things that they are expected to do due to an institutional projection. So the institution may suggest that, well, a Catholic has to do X, Y, and Z and believe in A, B, and C. But many Catholics could reject that. I'm going to use a personal example now. My mother-in-law was born Catholic, raised Catholic, still identifies as Catholic, but hasn't attended a Catholic church service in the best part of 10 years due to a disagreement that she had with her priest over same-sex marriage. She's very pro same-sex marriage, and due to that disagreement, she felt uncomfortable going to his services and hasn't gone since. But she is still a Catholic. And that doesn't mean that she is a bad Catholic for not going to church. In fact, I would say that she's actually a very good Catholic for supporting same-sex marriage.
I think it also kind of goes to show that just because, if the institutional religion, like the Vatican is saying, oh, you can't be, it's not good to be homosexual, it's not good to be trans, it's not good to be whatever. That doesn't mean that every single Catholic believes that you do get other people going, actually... No, I think that's fine. I think that's okay. I think you can be these things, and it's not a bad thing to be. So when you are, encountering, if you're reading a book or you're watching a show and every single adherent of a religion believes the exact same things to the letter, going, well, that's what the doctrine says, or that's what the higher ups say, it's very unrealistic. You're going to have people rejecting certain elements. You're going to have people doing other small things. You're going to have different understandings and interpretations.
People have autonomy.
They do. They have agency, and they will act on that agency.
Yeah, absolutely. What I find really interesting, though, is, and this is what you're tapping into here, this is a very dominant narrative regarding institution and institutionalized religion. And I think it has certainly been a major factor in the rise of the concept of the spiritual but not religious, the
Yes.
SBNRs, individuals who do not want to describe themselves as religious because of the connotations with institutional religion. And there is this blanket approach to something like Catholicism, for example, where everybody must believe the same thing because this is what the Vatican says. However, and I don't know how this is from an American perspective, but in British perspective, when it comes to politics, the idea of a broad church, and this is the language they'll use, is very commonly understood and discussed in political parties. So when we're recording this, the day after the vote
Right.
of confidence in Boris Johnson. And there were so many conversations on the news last night because I watched it all because I hate myself. And there were all these conversations about how the party is a broad church. And there's different types of Conservative Party members. There are, you have David Cameron types who are a little bit more centrist and aren't entirely on board with Boris Johnson. There's the Johnson supporters who've turned against him over these parties, and then of course there's Johnson supporters. There are lots of different types of Conservative members, and then the same thing happened with the Labour Party, and is still happening with the Labour Party, but it particularly became a common topic of discussion in British media when Jeremy Corbyn led the Labour Party, because there was this discussion about how Corbyn is shifting the party to the left, but he needs to be mindful of keeping Labour as a broad church, so he still needs to welcome in the Blairites and the centrists, for example, and he did that by having centrists on his in his cabinet. And now that Keir Starmer's leader, the party's going back to a more centrist approach, and there's conversations about where do the left now stand in the party. Well, I'm essentially taking my time to say that the idea of different types of Labour Party members and the idea of different types of Conservative Party members and so on is very easily and commonly grasped in everyday discourse in the UK, but not with religion. And of course, I would say we are essentially talking about religion here anyway. We're talking about ideological allegiances. What's more religion? But that aside, it's very commonly discussed. I heard it be discussed last night, the idea of a broad church in the Conservative Party. However, and we see this particularly with problematic depictions of Islam in media, that nuance is entirely gone. So many different types of media, especially right-wing media as well. Because there are a number of right-wing media sources popping up at the moment, such as GB News, for example, and so forth. And I think that odious Piers Morgan has a show now that nobody watches. But there's all this conversation about the cult of woke and cancel culture and so on, where nuance is entirely out of the window in these discussions. However, generally speaking, in terms of the mainstream media sources, things like the BBC and Channel 4 News, Sky News, your typical TV news outlets, the idea of different types of Conservatives, different types of Labour members is very readily discussed, but nuance is lost when it comes to religion.
Yeah, the thing is,
I'm just taking my time to climb down from my high horse.
And it's something that is, I think, good for people to keep in mind, especially when they're just living the world. Because I think a lot of what we are trying to do on this podcast is also to make it so when you are ingesting media and partaking in it, because I think we also believe here that it is not just a passive thing when you are enjoying media, it is an active thing. But when you are actively enjoying your media, to be thinking about these things. And I mean, I enjoy things that can be problematic. Of course, we all do. But I think as long as you are acknowledging that and recognizing that and not taking that in and then going as well as, oh, well, then I, continue to outwardly also in my day-to-day think of, say, Muslims as kind of all one one block, or Hinduism as all one block, when really there's a lot of nuance. And I mean, when you're what makes people really interesting to study, whether it is from the perspective of politics, or whether it's the perspective of religion, or it's the perspective of cosplay, like, what makes people really fascinating are their nuances. People are inherently nuancy, complicated, ridiculous people to try to pin down and explain and define. And that's kind of what makes it fun.
Yeah, it's the discourses. I just love looking at those discourses. I don't know about you, but something I'm really interested in at the moment, and not that I've written anything on it, just something that I enjoy doing in my personal time, is when I walk around a particularly populated area, like a city, for example, stickers on lampposts. The discourses taking place from simply sticking stickers on lampposts is endlessly fascinating to me right now. Particularly stickers that get torn off, because you can spot an aggressively torn off sticker. So I was recently exploring Leeds, and a Marxist society had placed stickers everywhere, but particularly on lampposts, and some of them had been really aggressively torn down and so on. And just seeing conversations take place like that between people who aren't interacting verbally, or even in terms of writing to each other, but there's messages being sent there and responded to. Such an interesting way. I love looking at lampposts right now. Please don't quote that.
There was one that I saw just yesterday, because we were driving back from Wales to Salisbury, and we stopped off at Avebury to have a bit of tea before doing the last hour or whatever it is back to Salisbury. And we were in the bathrooms at Avebury, and in the stall there was a sticker that had been put on, and then it had been aggressively ripped off, and then somebody had written something on where it had been aggressively ripped off, which had then been crossed out in Sharpie, and then next to it the same Sharpie had written "trans rights are human rights" with a heart. And so I was like, I don't know what happened here. I don't know which was the sticker transphobic, or was it pro-trans that someone then ripped off and then wrote something transphobic, and then the next person went in and said screw you. And it's an interesting, it's almost like a really slow internet page, isn't it?
Yes, I have a friend who is actively involved in placing pro-trans stickers on lampposts, and will make pro-trans stickers, buy pro-trans stickers, and will go around their town placing it and tearing down transphobic ones. It's a really important thing.
My local Pride does gives out free stickers of either the rainbow flag or the trans flag, and love is love type things, so you could go around covering up transphobic or homophobic messages with the pro stickers.
I was in London a few weeks ago, and at King's Cross I saw a Yes Cymru sticker, which is the pro-Welsh independence movement in King's Cross. So that was quite fun to see, because I've recently been back to Wales, visited my parents. So my parents live in a very small rural Welsh town, so it won't surprise you to know that those stickers are everywhere in that town, just stuck everywhere. Some of them placed by my father, no doubt. Those are ever, but occasionally I'll see one in England, and it's really interesting to see. I love the idea of stickers and that sort of discourse. I think
that kind of leads us into I'd put it as a second point in our notes, but I think it's kind of an extension of what we're talking about, which is the idea of folk practice or vernacular religion, which is kind of what we're talking about when we say lived religion versus institutional. It's the lived religion part. It's the way that people behave. Do you have a better definition, that rather than me rambling?
Yeah, I would say that vernacular religion isn't just about folk religion. The brilliant thing about the model of vernacular religion, and everyone should check out Leonard Primiano's work on vernacular religion, which was pioneering, and of course the work of Marion Bowman, for example, as well. The what's wonderful about vernacular religion in particular, particularly Leonard Primiano's work, was the focus on objects and material culture that I find really interesting. But it's all about the everyday and everyday expressions of religiosity. An expression of religiosity can be a number of things. It can be use of prayer beads, for example. It can be a photo of Ganesha on one's wall. But it can also be a video game controller. It can also be one's cosplay outfit. These are all aspects of vernacular religion, everyday expressions of religion that are not dictated by top-down projections of what religion should be. Essentially, the word I'm looking for is grassroots. Something that rises from the ground, that everyday people do, that is not necessarily instructed to them by powers that be.
Yeah, I always think of it as, how religion is very flexible. It's not these rigid things. It's very flexible, and it will fit into any context a person brings it into. And sometimes it has to be molded to fit that context. Sometimes it has to be shaped a little different. But people will do it. They'll mold it and they'll shape it, and then it'll end up looking really different. So, I mean, just talking about Christianity or Catholicism, like we already have been, Catholicism is going to look massively different in the Vatican City than it does in Indonesia, than it does in the rural United States. And each of these locations are still Catholicism or Christianity or Islam or whatever it is that you want to plug in there. They're all going to look different, but they all are still those things. And it's mostly because of the context of the people that are living there needing different things, because they're living different lives than the people that are somewhere on the other side of the world.
And this is why we break down that sui generis model of religion. That religion is an entity unto itself. It's something that exists on its own and can be separated from its context and from other factors such as politics, for example. Religion is always embedded in these issues, and that's why it is going to look different depending on the area in which you find it, the economic circumstances of the people identifying as Catholic in one area to another. That alone is going to have an impact on how that looks, and the ways that people understand their Catholicism. So I'm just running with the example of Catholic. You can
plug in anything.
But the ways those are understood can be impacted by one's financial status or one's background in education or political allegiances, so on.
So I'm going to use another example from that podcast. I'm sorry, I'm just going to do this, because this is one of the things that made me really start thinking about whether or not we should do an episode on this, which is they were in this one area, and they were engaging with people who are in this world, I'm sure you could imagine, the religion is very Christian based, and it is seen as the bad guy, as is not exactly new. But they were in this one area, and they were kind of chatting with just the everyday people that were there, and they decided to kind of figure out what the folk practices would be. How is just someone who lives in this area practicing this religion that is somehow slightly different than you would see somewhere else, which is like, cool, perfect. That's what we're thinking, is what kind of items do they have in their house? What does their house look like that reflects this type of thing? And they started talking about candles, like you sometimes get in Santeria or more Latina-based Christianities will have candles, and with like the saint and stuff on it. So they were like, oh, maybe we could do that. And the DM said that they were a little bit nervous about doing that because they didn't want a Latino Christianity or a Santeria religion to be seen as bad because the church is the bad guy in the world, which I find really fascinating. That again, and this I guess goes back to the other point as well, that there wasn't a separation between the institution can be bad, but that doesn't mean the people practicing a religion are bad. And
Yes.
that doesn't make their, quote unquote beliefs or whatever that they're doing with the religion as necessarily bad. It depends a lot. Like, I think, again, Catholicism has done a lot of really terrible things. The institution of Catholicism has been horrendous. But that doesn't mean that, our family members are terrible people. Like,
yeah, and we find this in terms of our in the study of new religions, for example, that a lot of new religious movements have done dreadful things, but that doesn't necessarily mean that it's endorsed by its everyday practitioners, or even that the everyday practitioners are aware of it.
Yeah, we talked about this a little bit in our Mary Cosby episode.
That they just don't even know what's happening.
Which, if you're interested in that and you didn't listen to it because it was a Real Housewives thing, go and listen to it, because we only it's mostly just a jumping off point to talk about new religious movements rather than a focus on Real Housewives.
Oh, but it was still really interesting.
I have it on our notes to go back to that, and I'm going to give you episodes to watch, because they talked about it in this latest season, which...
They talked about our podcast?
Oh, god damn, wouldn't that be amazing?
That would be kind of amazing.
No, they talked about, because before we had when we looked at it, it was all the way that the internet had been talking about it, because no one on the show had been discussing her religion as potentially a cult. But then they started talking about it because the internet was talking about it, so now it's a storyline that they can bring into the show. And so the way they go about talking about it is really fascinating. And there was a lovely comment by one of the women who also is, just by the way, is a horrendous human being. I am not endorsing her at all. But she had one lovely sentence that she said on the reunion, where they were kind of like, oh, so what do you think about, this church? Is it a cult? And she said, well, I think every religion could be a cult. And every religion probably is.
Surprising amount of nuance.
I was like, oh, yes!
Yes.
Have you listened to our podcast episode?
Yes, it's the Marmite analogy. For non-UK based listeners, Marmite has a slogan that's very popular in the UK. You either love it or you hate it. Now, I know that's not a particularly nuanced take on Marmite, because you may just be somewhat keen on Marmite. But it's you can apply it to this cultic discourse because it's about one's perspective. One person's religion is another person's cult, and vice versa. It's their Marmite.
Yeah.
Yep, I've just killed this conversation.
I'm not a big fan of Marmite.
What? Marmite's great. See, now we can see these discourses playing out. I love Marmite. I could just eat the whole top of it with a spoon.
So they also sell this thing in the UK called Twiglets, which are like... Oh. So you don't like Twiglets?
No, Twiglets I can't... I don't like Twiglets, interestingly, and you'd think I would, wouldn't you?
So Twiglets are supposed to... It's like coated in like it's like a pretzel or something that's then like coated in like a Marmite. And I have had Twiglets that are not the Marmite flavored, and I liked them. Not a fan of the Marmite ones. I had some of it when I was at my in-laws, and I like hacked for hours, just go. Like, it was
really
so bad. I'm sorry for doing that again.
Have you ever? No. Have you ever tried Marmite cheese?
No, because that sounds disgusting.
Well, obviously I can't have it anymore because I'm vegan and better than everyone. But in the days when I wasn't vegan and wasn't better than everyone, I used to really enjoy Marmite cheese. They were these little circular balls of cheese, kind of like baby bells. But they tasted like Marmite and cheese at the same time. And yeah, if you don't take Marmite, it is going to be the most repulsive thing in the world.
Tom likes Marmite, so I'll ask if
Marmite cheese is
he's
amazing.
Tried Marmite cheese, and then I will.
If they bring Marmite cheese a vegan Marmite cheese out, I'll be all over that. And if the Marmite Company are listening, I am happy for you to sponsor our podcast.
I think you have very high expectations of our listenership.
Could you imagine? Today's episode is sponsored by Marmite.
Oh, we'd have to get some kind of sponsors first.
Yes.
I think what this comes down to, Marmite aside, I think.
Well, we've just seen discourses take place.
Yeah, that some people hate Marmite.
Yes.
I do think that Tom, to kind of go into the idea of the slogan not being nuanced, but then people actually are nuanced, is I think Tom is one of those who is just kind of keen on Marmite. Because, I mean, I don't buy Marmite because I don't like it. So.
Oh, I'm ride or die for Marmite.
There you go. You've got our nuance there. We've got a love, a hate,
yeah.
and then it's all right. That's our broad church of Marmite.
I could live off that stuff.
So I think that a lot of what we are talking comes down to is kind of a similar and again separate point in my notes, which is that religion is not all about belief or doctrine. And this is often what people kind of try to boil things down to. I was recently chatting with a friend of mine, a new friend of mine, and we were chatting about...
You're making new friends?
I made new friends, and they're cosplay people, and they're lovely.
Oh, I'm so proud of you.
And so, yeah, we were chatting about cosplay stuff, and they're writing a book on fandom, so I was talking about my experience of researching fandom and religion. So we were just kind of chatting. And I mentioned, I was like, because defining religion is really tough and no one really has a definition for it. And they were like, oh, I thought it would have just been about belief. And it was like, let me try not to suddenly go into a 4-hour lecture. But I luckily was able to do it because they are still my friend. Because I think if I had otherwise, I don't know if they would have stayed in touch. But basically, it is a lot more complicated than that. And I think if you are thinking of religion when you're either crafting it or listening to something or watching something with a religion, if you're thinking of it as like a database table where you fill in, this is the name of the religion, this is the founder, this is the book, these are the main tenets, this is how you pray,
this is the book.
Yeah, if you fill in all of those things, if that's how you think of religion, then you're wrong.
Yes, absolutely. As soon as you mentioned
there
book,
is no set definition of religion, but that one is not.
Yeah, and you often find this as well with the wording, oh, this is the Bible of X religion. Oh, so what's their main book? I get that as somebody who researches Scientology. People often ask me, so what's their main book? What's their singular holy text, and it's such a problematic way of framing it. And I don't know if I've mentioned this on the podcast before, but I'll mention it again because it's a really interesting point about religious literacy. I heard a rabbi discussing the Torah on BBC Radio 2. And I'm not sure this would have happened if the conversation was taking place on Radio 4, which is a lot more talk discussion based than Radio 2, which is a much more casual music listening station. And I like listening to BBC Radio 2 because I'm now in my 30s and it's downhill from here. But there was a rabbi on one morning and he was simply reciting a quotation from the Torah and explaining it. And he explained it to the DJ and the listeners as the Jewish Bible. And he didn't use the term Torah. He said the Jewish Bible. And I just kind of felt sad because obviously he knows it's a Torah. He's a rabbi. But he clearly did feel the need to make, because it's not the Jewish Bible. It's a Torah.
It's its own thing. It existed before as well.
And this is the problem I have in the study of religion sometimes, is the way that religion is compared to Christianity, or if something's a religion, then it has to tick several of the boxes that that Christianity has. If you think of it like Wittgenstein's family resemblances, there has to be a certain amount of resemblances to Christianity for it to be like a religion. And I saw that at play there, and I thought, that could have been a really great opportunity to have taught the audience to know that, okay, so the Torah is a really important text in
Yeah.
Judaism. But instead it was communicated as the Jewish Bible. And, I have no doubt he had his reasons
I'm
for
sure
saying
he
that and so
struggled
forth.
in the past,
But yeah, absolutely, I'm sure that he has, sadly. But I just thought it was incredibly interesting that he did that.
Yeah, that's a shame. But yeah, that's
Yeah,
so when I
it
was
is
in
interesting,
my
isn't
when I
it?
was doing my undergrad, I was dating a person at the time who tried to fight me on a lot of the religion stuff that I was learning because, that's what men do sometimes. And
So then you dumped his ass.
because just because I'm a woman and studying it, he clearly knows more than me. But
Yeah.
But
Yeah, of course.
basically, I had mentioned something about, religion not having a definition offhand. And he said, well, wouldn't it have to do with doctrine? And I said, well, not all religion has doctrine. And he did not believe me. And I had to start listing things. And I'm like, well, technically, like, this religion doesn't have a doctrine. And I used things like Santeria or Candomblé as things that didn't have like a written or even a non-written list of things. It's a practice. It's a community. It's a relationship. It's not a doctrine. And it was basically, he was like, well, then that probably just isn't religion. And I was like, I think if you saw any amount of this, you'd be like, well, clearly they're doing religion. Like,
Yeah. I used to have a friend, but for coincidentally back when I was an undergraduate, who used to kick off, and I mean kick off at the any implication of the idea of Jediism being a legitimate religion. Despite the fact that, and I find this endlessly fascinating, despite the fact that he was an atheist and all religion is bad, there's still this sanctity almost of what religion is, that when you can't possibly suggest that something as frivolous and silly as Jediism is an actual religion, even though I find this nuance regarding bad religion amongst particularly new atheist groups really interesting, that they will be so anti-religion but will still value it to the extent where they will distinguish between a religion and a cult, or a religion and a fake religion, and so on. That's just really interesting. But and then again, so very similar to what you were just saying, Vivian, I try and break it down and show how Jediism is a religion.
Well, I feel like Jediism fits. I mean, when you're talking about the fact that people kind of have to check the same boxes as Christianity, which I don't agree with, but Jediism checks a lot of the boxes. So, like, if you're gonna have one, like.
And it comes down to as well what I was saying earlier about approaches to religion, that if something has heritage, if something is old, then it is therefore more legitimate. And I'm not going to get into my rant about how all religions were once new, but if something is older, then it's often seen as more legitimate in terms of religiosity.
And if people want to hear us talk more about Jediism, there was an episode last season on invented religions. Go check it out.
There was, and I probably mentioned this guy back then as well.
I'm sure.
That and he'll probably pop up again.
But yeah,
well.
and even belief is really hazy. Like, doctrine is hazy. Sometimes there's things that don't have texts. There's a lot of religion that isn't written, but there's also religion that doesn't really have beliefs or doesn't care. I was a practicing Buddhist for a long time. I still sometimes say I'm Buddhist if people ask, but I don't know. Getting into self-definitions is weird. But I was a practicing Buddhist for a long time, and the beliefs in Buddhism, particularly like Korean Zen and Japanese Zen, are just like, it's all just like whatever. So, it's like, is there a God? I don't know. Do you think there is? Then sure. Like,
yeah, absolutely. A colleague of ours once said something absolutely brilliant, and I often think about this. I'm not going to name him because when he said this, we had both had a few
That's
drinks
fair.
and were a little bit worse for wear. So it's not something that he would probably want to publish, but I think the point is actually really interesting in terms of a casual podcast conversation. What he said was, people don't really believe in anything, they just sort of go along with it. And I think that's an absolutely brilliant way of framing so much conversation about belief. Now, I'm sure if you wanted to discuss that in an article, it would be far more nuanced and articulate. But in terms of a casual conversation, something about that really simple statement that he said really struck a chord with me, because that is a very interesting way and of looking at so many everyday aspects
Yeah,
of
I think I'd have
religion.
to think about the extent
That
to which I agree with that, but I think there is a lot of truth in it at the very
it
least.
was said but this is why I haven't
Yeah, I
named
get it. It's
the colleague, because it was said
I get
somewhat
it.
flippantly. It wasn't a solid rule.
But yeah,
Um,
I think in the past I've mentioned before the fact that I like to think of belief as like being at a public pool, where a lot of
yeah,
people
I really like
use
this
the word. A
analogy.
lot of people use the word belief thinking of the person who has cannonballed and is now in the bottom of the pool completely submerged. They think of that. But in reality, there's a lot of other people at the pool than just the guy that keeps diving to the very bottom. There are people who are, swimming around, and they might dip their whole head in occasionally, but they're not. Then there's people who stick in the shallow end. There are people who paddle back and forth, but they don't get their hair wet. And there are some people who just sit on the side and they never put their foot in the water at all. But they're there.
But they
They
still
go
go
along
along.
and
Yeah.
they're there and they're talking to
Yeah.
you and they're at the pool. They would say, I'm at the pool, but they're not in the water. So there's all sorts of different levels of engagement with it. And all of those people would probably use the word belief, and they might use it in different ways, because English sucks. English sucks as a language. And
Well, that's the other thing, isn't it? Is we are limited by
we are.
language here when discussing incredibly complicated and often internal
Yeah, and we don't have ways to
processes.
explain it. And I explain it to my cosplay friend as saying things like, you can even use the word belief in all sorts of different ways. So like if I was on this podcast and I said, I really believe in my husband, I don't think a lot of people would immediately assume that I'm worshiping him and I think he's a god. I think that he's right a lot of times. I trust him. I have a relationship with him that I believe is strong. Again,
You believe that he's definitely there.
there's a lot of that is present.
Yeah.
And you could also relate that to a religion, and that doesn't necessarily mean the same things. It could be the same things. It could mean a different thing, because we suck at talking.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's like describing a color.
Yeah.
How do you describe the color blue? You can't,
Yeah.
without saying that it's like something, and that's where the problems begin. Because it's like the Jewish Bible, for example.
Yeah, you have to relate it to something that people actively recognize.
And then there's that whole conversation then about the world religions paradigm.
That's a different day. I think that's a different day.
Yeah. That is a different day, because that's going to be an ultra special bumper episode of all bells and whistles.
I need
that
more
is just
tea
a
before
whole-
we go into that one.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
Well, I think
Oh, it's so
I think
interesting,
we've
isn't
covered.
it?
I mean, a lot of it comes down to lived experiences, and
Yes.
that people are complicated and nuanced and adaptive, and they have agency. And these are all things that need to be kept in mind when writing about people, and a very fundamental human experience of religion. So, I don't know. I don't know how many of our listeners are people who craft worlds in whatever that might mean for the people that are listening. But I hope that it was useful.
But don't we all craft
Oh,
worlds,
well,
Vivian?
this is why, as soon as
Yeah,
I came on the call and I was
yeah.
like, we're going to talk about this, and Alan was like, oh, what do you mean by fictional worlds? I'm like, ugh.
I meant it sincerely. I wasn't
I
I
know
wasn't
you
trying
did.
to.
That's the problem.
I wasn't trying to be a pain.
No, I mean, it was a fair point. Especially because if it was
But
the
if
other way
if
around,
you're
it'd be like, well, what's fiction, Alan?
oh yeah, I know you too well. If if any of our lovely listeners are in the process of creating religions or have done in the past, or maybe even feel a sense of belonging to something that would not be conventionally described
Like
as a
cosplay?
religion, I would love to. Yeah, I would love to hear about that. When I was we were once given a task to create a religion during my undergrad days, and this was in 2007. So it was hot off the heels of My Chemical Romance's Black Parade album, which is a concept album, and I built a religion based around the concept of the
Mm-hmm.
album and the performance of the album as a conceptual piece. And I'm still quite proud of it. I imagine if I went back and looked at what I wrote now, I would, die of embarrassment with some of my very simplistic approaches to religion. But at the time, I was
Yeah.
quite proud of it.
When I was doing my undergrad, I was a double major in creative writing and religious studies. And whenever I said that to any, the number of
Mm,
times I got, what are you going to do with that? Make your own religion. I'm like,
ooh, what are you going to do with that? Well, yeah.
anyway. But
Um,
you can get in touch with the
yeah.
pod if you have questions about what we talked about, like if we weren't very clear about certain things and you want clarity on it, or if you just want to give your 2 cents. We're always happy to hear your 2 cents. It is a dialogue, as we have discussed. Dialogue is important, and discourse and the nuance
Discourse.
in our conversations. Then let us know. We have a Twitter, which is at RPC_pod, in which you can get in touch with the pod there. And we also have an email address now. I mean, I had one before, but it was not pod specific. But now there is a pod specific one. And so you can reach out to the pod on religion pop culture at, or no, sorry. Ooh, it is religion pop culture pod at gmail.com. I'll write it in the description. But religion
Yeah,
pop culture
that
pod.
sounds good. We'd love to. We'd love that. I've recently started listening to the brand new Kermit and Mayo
Mm-hmm.
podcast that they've just set up, and their first batch of one of their first batch of emails contained an email from Stephen
Oh,
Fry. So I want us to match that level, please,
you
folks.
know.
I, I, I would like. I'm not necessarily looking for Stephen Fry. Stephen, if you are listening, please do get in touch about
If
anything. I
Stephen,
would
if
just
you were
love to hear
listening,
from
I
you.
have some comments about some of the things you've said on QI where I can discuss your view on religion. I would be happy to
Yes.
dissect that.
Yeah, happy to dissect. And knowing Stephen Fry, he would be absolutely game. But if we could match that level of content, that would be absolutely great. So that's all on you, listeners. That's nothing
Yeah.
to do with us. Get in, get